Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we have one of our annual events, and that is to look at the highlights of PwC's 2020 Annual Corporate Director Survey. And joining me, who's somebody who is on top of all this information and data, is Leah Malone, who's the Director of PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Leah.
Hi, thank you.
So it's that time of the year again, and it should be very interesting this year, knowing that we've had COVID-19 crisis, and we've also had the social justice unrest around the country. So why don't you start by sharing with us what your first highlight is from the always anticipated annual survey?
Yeah, it's interesting doing the survey this year against this backdrop, as you allude to, some big things going on in the country and in the world. So we were really curious to see how those issues would impact how directors are thinking about their own jobs and how their companies and management are doing. So one of the things that really stood out to us as we were collecting responses from this year's survey was that we asked about specifically crisis management and how boards felt they were prepared to deal with crisis management, as well as how their management teams dealt with the crisis, and specifically the COVID-19 pandemic, up to the point in time that we asked them. What we found was that, in general, directors gave their management teams very high marks. They were very impressed with how management handled supply chain interruptions, how they handled things like moving to a remote workforce, all the things that went along with the pandemic. Even though those of us from kind of a customer client angle may not have felt that all of those issues were perfectly addressed by management, board gave them high marks. But when we asked about how boards felt about their own preparedness when it came to crisis management, we were really surprised. Only 37% of directors said that they felt that their board fully understood their crisis management plan. This number is quite anemic, much smaller than we would have hoped, especially at this moment when crisis management plans were very much coming into play. And the idea that boards didn't really even understand how their companies were meant to be managing these issues as they popped up. I think there's a big opportunity there for boards and management teams to really focus going forward.
So, no surprise. I mean, this crisis, we've been preaching for how long, on this show, and you guys from the center, about the importance of preparing, and either doing dry runs or making sure that they know what's happening here. So I hope this is a sort of kick in the butt that people, reemphasizes the need for doing some crisis planning at the board level. So,
Exactly.
um,
And, our advice to boards and to management teams now is to take this moment. Obviously, we've only gone through, one element of this continuing crisis, but to take this moment, if you haven't done it yet, to look back at your crisis management plan, what worked, what didn't, what needs tweaking, and start putting those changes into place now. I really think there's kind of no time to lose on that topic.
So, with all the stakeholder centric discussion and the social issues, I'm sure that ESG played a big part in your survey this year.
It did play a big part. And I think we were surprised again with the results that we saw when it comes to ESG. On the one side, I think we saw some decent improvements. When we're asking directors about whether ESG topics are on their board's agenda, we saw nice improvements in the percentage of directors saying, yes, their boards are talking about these issues. They're making their way into board meetings. We also saw an increasing percentage of directors saying that they think ESG disclosure should be a priority for management to be focusing on. But we were a little bit disappointed in some other ways as well in terms of the elevation of ESG issues in the board. We still see only about half of directors saying that their board actually understands ESG issues. And only 38% of directors think that ESG issues actually have a financial impact on the company. So there's a bit of a disconnect between directors drawing the line between the ESG issues that investors are pushing on so hard thinking about how those things work in the company and how they matter to the company. And from there, how it impacts the company's bottom line, if not today, in the future, because that's what investors are really pushing on. It's not ESG for the sake of ESG. It's ESG because that's what gets to the company's long-term strategic plan and plan for the future.
So last year there was a significant gap. So has it at least narrowed a little bit? Because last year there was a real gap between how investors felt and in turn how boards felt.
I think we are seeing a narrowing, and like I said, there were some areas where boards are reporting improvement in terms of talking about the issues, elevating them in the boardroom. For instance, a greater percentage of directors think that issues like climate change should have an impact on company strategy. That's encouraging, again, not for the sake of climate change, but because it gets to this idea that company strategy, in particular long-term company strategy, needs to be bringing other things into the mix, thinking about how climate change will affect the company, issues like human rights, immigration, all of those topics. More directors are saying that company strategy should incorporate those ideas.
Well, when we talk about ESG, you can't sort of talk about it without talking about diversity.
Yeah.
And, probably more than gender this year has been sort of racial equality in the C-suite in the boardroom, on that side. So, what in the survey this year, what sort of questions or angles did you attack relative to diversity?
Yep. So the diversity questions, there's sort of two angles that we take. One is diversity efforts at the company, and the second relates to board diversity. So, as to the first point about diversity at the company, we asked directors whether they supported the idea that companies should be doing more to promote racial and ethnic diversity at the company. Overwhelmingly, directors agree with this idea. 84% of directors say that companies should be doing more in this area. But when we push on that question a little bit more, we asked about what types of non-financial metrics should make their way into executive pay plans, with the idea that what gets measured gets done. So we asked about things like, should safety be a part of your metrics? Should customer satisfaction? Issues like that aren't directly related to the bottom line. And when we asked about whether diversity and inclusion goals should be a part of executive pay plans, we saw a really small amount of support for that idea. 84% of directors think companies should do more in this area. Only 39% of directors think that those metrics related to diversity and inclusion should be included in executive pay plans. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, again, as we think about directors saying, yes, these issues are important. We want our companies to be doing something about it, but they're not quite willing to take the step of saying, look, it's so important that we're going to be signaling, number one, to our executive team that these are issues that you need to be focusing on, because once they make their way into the executive pay plans, executives know that they really are important to the board. And number two, obviously, that you're going to be measured on these topics. So still, I think, work to be done there in terms of company diversity and inclusion efforts. The second area, of course, relates to board diversity. As you mentioned, the idea of board diversity, of course, has been with us for years. There's been such a strong push toward gender diversity, lots of changes from the institutional investors. We see laws in this area. Boards are really doing a lot of work to diversify when it comes to gender. But when it comes to racial and ethnic diversity, I think that's been a lagging issue for quite a long time. And when we look at how directors support the idea of diversity, much stronger support for the fact that gender diversity is important on boards, less support for the idea that racial and ethnic diversity is important on boards. So we have about half of directors saying, yes, it's important to have gender diversity. Only 34% of directors say it's really important for their board to have racial and ethnic diversity. I do think that the conversation around board diversity, at the same time, it's changing with respect to the companies and what companies are doing in this area against the backdrop of everything we've lived through in 2020. I think that conversation is certainly changing at the board level as well, in particular with the recent California law just a couple of weeks ago requiring boards to have representatives from underrepresented communities on their boards. I think that will start to shift the conversation a little bit more as well.
Well, this in the whole ESG space, people have been struggling with measurement of what's happening. Although the World Economic Forum has come out with some guidelines with their CEO group, which I think is really starting to make everything take shape, relative to this. Um, this show actually did a four-part series on um, systemic racism in the boardroom, which I think people would find interesting. And you're right, the California was the sort of the first step. And also, just recently, Starbucks has announced that they were attaching compensation goals and targets to their senior management and the compensation plan. So typically, when a large company like that makes that move, the institutional investors will, point to that and start to put pressure on other companies to sort of follow suit. So all that's going to be interesting, I think, to watch. There is headway, but I agree with you. There's still a little bit of a block or a hurdle to get the racial equality in the boardroom, get us over the hump. So I can't possibly interview you without asking for us to look at the infamous question about how directors feel about replacing that somebody on their board should be replaced. So I'm anxious to hear because we've seen a steady climb from the high 20s, 30s, many years ago to now close to 50% of the directors feeling that there's at least one board member on their board that they feel should be replaced. So give us the numbers for your 2020.
Exactly. Yes, 49% of directors say that at least one of their fellow directors on the board should be replaced. About half of those directors are saying it's not just one, it's two or more than two who should be replaced on the board. As you say, we look at this number every year, and it's once we get the survey results back, it's one of those questions we turn to right away to see how the number is changing. I think we always expect it to start ticking down at some point as there's such continuous focus on board composition, on board turnover, refreshment, bringing new voices into the room. But the number remains high. It's stubbornly high, I would say. And part of where we think boards could be doing more in this area, we all know that refreshment is difficult, that turnover is difficult. In particular, as we're asking directors about their practices on their board, what we find is that there's probably an insufficient focus on succession planning inside boards. So only about half of directors say that their board actually has a succession plan that they share with everyone. About a third say that succession planning is ad hoc on their board, that there really is no plan to speak of until someone raises their hand and says, okay, I'm getting ready to retire. 10% of directors say that there's no plan at all. So when we look at that and we think about, well, how can they be comfortable with where the board is going? How can they know what the next chapter will look like if there's no plan in place at all? How can we get somewhere when we don't know how we're going to go? So that's an area that we really encourage boards to look at, and for board leadership to really focus on. At a minimum, it's not always about starting to push out directors, but once you come up with a plan of what we want our board to look like 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what types of skills and expertise do we want on our board? What do we want our diversity makeup to look like? That can start to give the directors on the board a sense of, okay, now I know where we're going. Let's think about how we all either fit into that picture or start to move, rotate off of this board and into other opportunities.
So if I'm an institutional investor and I see, like your expectation and my expectation, that this number isn't even going down, okay, I've got to be very disappointed in just all the processes of how a board and board leadership manages its board composition and the skill sets that are needed. Um, People complain about turnover as it is, that there isn't much turnover. And now you see a number for, that's high for one and even two board members to be replaced. I mean, it's just a giant red flag. And it says, what does that say about the board evaluation process? I mean, that process, a lot of people say to me, listen, we don't need age limits, because if you're good at board evaluations, that, you will have refreshment and you'll weed out the skills that you don't need. And again, it's not always a bad director. Okay. It can be a need for skill set changes. Okay. A lot of the directors may not have lived in uh, this sort of virtual world or through e-commerce or whatever the current trends are. And you may need to get directors on there for that. And it just, as somebody that has been involved in board evaluations for 30 years, it is just frustrating to me that people do the evaluations and yet they do not take the action that's necessary once they get the data back. And
Yeah.
if I was an investor, I am frustrated.
Yeah, and what we consistently find again is the boards that do the evaluations, the actions that they take out of those evaluations tend to be things like changing committee memberships, shuffling people around on the board. The percentage of directors whose boards actually counsel underperforming directors or encourage someone to think about stepping off the board is really small. So again, it's kind of a lack of leadership, I think, in pushing on those tough actions.
And I want to get on my soapbox one more time about your point about succession, because when I look at and talk to a lot of boards and ask them about replacing board chairs, and I don't think that enough companies think about in the recruitment process, okay, who is well equipped and has the skill set to serve as the chair of the different boards, particularly audit, obviously, and the financial expert, but now also compensation, which has as much scrutiny as audit used to have. So that whole succession thing is, if you take boards as a whole, has done a very poor job with it. But obviously, certain boards have good leadership, stay on top, have succession, and you can see it. But as a whole, a great area for improvement in my mind. So, one of the things that we haven't talked about that I wanted to ask you about is one of the things that certainly is in the future for these boards is uh, their business purpose. Okay, we've heard a lot about companies going to have to sort of describe what their business purpose is. And obviously, investors are looking to make sure that this is where the stakeholder is not forgotten, in this. So, in your survey this year, have you asked questions about business purpose?
We have, yes. And there, I think it's encouraging when we look at how directors think about this issue. So, about 67% agree with the idea that companies should have a social purpose. Another 67% think that companies should actually disclose metrics related to that company purpose. And 85% agree that having a company purpose is not mutually exclusive with company profitability. So, this idea that companies need to stand for a little bit more, that they're not just there to be money making machines for their shareholders, I think is very strong. I think most directors really show a lot of support for that idea. Whether or not they're kind of taking all the steps to support that social purpose, I think is probably unclear at this point, but at least there's a lot of kind of support for the idea of it.
Well, I think certainly that's going to be a bigger and bigger issue.
Mhm.
It's going to be interesting to see how all that sorts out, starting with proxies this year and then, moving forward on how companies are communicating with shareholders. So I'm sure it'll be a big part of your survey next year. So
Already thinking about next year.
I'm sure. I'm sure as soon as you publish this, all the work starts for next year. But
Exactly.
Leah, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. This has certainly been one of the lead surveys out there as far as people getting information on how a board's thinking. And we always like to sort of highlight those issues that are significant. And it's always great to have you on to bring us up to speed.
Great. Thank you. Take care.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.